Okay. Name and occupation.
My name is Donna Kim Murphy, and my occupation is I'm a neuroscientist and a neurologist.
Okay, so what is your educational background? Where did you go to undergrad? And if you went for more years, where did you go?
I went to undergrad at Harvard, um, and I studied the history of science. Afterwards, I went to Baylor College of Medicine, and I was in their MD PhD program.
That's pretty cool. History of science. I'm a history major right now, so that's really awesome. What inspired you to become a neurologist, and how did you get started in the field?
Um, I guess a number of things. I have in my family, like a lot of people who have had neurological diseases. So my brother had childhood epilepsy that seemed to resolve on its own after a couple of years of drug therapy. And then I have now three grandparents, one who is still living, who had or have different kinds of dementia. And then we have also several of us have migraines in the family. So those are all neurological disorders. So that was some of what personally motivated me. And then I was just really, really interested in the brain. The brain is kind of like a new frontier that has become of great, I think, popular interest in the last, I don't know, like 30 years, 20, 30 years. Um, and yeah, I was interested just because it's so much is unknown about it, and it is like what explains everything that we do in our lives, the decisions that we make, the experiences that we have, the memories that we hold, all of the above. And so I was just kind of fascinated and wanted to study it. That was neuroscience, and then neurology is like the clinical application of neuroscience. There I was like more interested in actually epilepsy patients because we can study the activity from their brains directly when they undergo epilepsy surgery. And that's when they're not responding to medications very well. Then there is, for some of them, a possibility that you can actually surgically remove the focus of seizures. And while they are evaluated for that, they actually have electrodes inside their brains directly measuring electrical activity from certain areas of the brain. So you can study, like, in a very elegant way, different parts of the brain and what those parts of the brain actually do while the person is like awake and participating in different kinds of experiments. So it was super, super interesting to me. Scientifically, and then also epilepsy is something that is curable, whereas many of the neurological disorders are not. And so I became very interested in that as a subspecialty area within neurology.
Wow, I did not know that epilepsy was curable. That's super interesting. So during your undergrad in Harvard, you studied history of science. Were there classes or experiences that really led you in the direction of neuroscience and neurology?
Yeah, so history of science, I think, kind of broadened my understanding of how science works. I think most of the public understands science as being a very exact thing that where there is like kind of an objective truth. And the history of science really taught me that that's not true, that science, like any human construct, any human endeavor, is subject to the ways in which we're fallible as human beings. And so it was really interesting for me to learn how we actually have constructed science historically. So at like different points in history, we've had very strange understandings of certain like phenomena in the natural world. Like there was a time where they thought that women were afflicted with like a condition where our uteruses would basically travel inside our bodies, like just like float around inside our bodies, and it would cause us to be like emotionally volatile. And that's where the word hysteria comes from. It's actually derivative of the word for uterus. And it was applied, that characterization was applied mostly to women, and it is a function of this thing that happened historically in terms of how we scientifically understood women and things like that, where I'm like, oh, it's clear that society is like shaping our understanding of the natural world. And I think that's like especially true for the brain and behavior. That is actually at the end of the day like so dependent on context. historical context, social context, political context. And, you know, a lot of things have been done in the name of science and neuroscience that have been like really problematic, I think, historically, in terms of like oppressing certain groups of people or exploiting certain groups of people, like, for instance, like the eugenics movement in the early 20th century, where, you know, like in Nazi Germany, for instance, right? And this is not explicitly, it's not exclusively true for Nazi Germany. It was also true in the United States and other parts of the world where we were applying like eugenic principles in like trying to create a race of superior beings, more or less. And that again is like where science was kind of like misused. So like that I think can really be true for our understanding of the brain and behavior. And I think that's what kind of drew me to that ultimately, is like the scientific thing of interest.
Very well spoken, Donna. So what did you do during your undergrad? Was there like research experiences you had in particular that you really liked?
Yeah, so I did a couple of things research wise. One was to work at the Massachusetts Eye and Ear Infirmary in it was like a lab studying retinal neurogenesis, which is basically like the back of the eye where the retina is. It's the nervous system part of the eye, like how that develops in like they're not babies, but they're like little zebrafish, like when they're embryos, right? And yeah, so I studied that, and that was just like, you know, wet lab work basically. That was okay. It was like scientifically interesting. But what was more interesting to me was a project that I spent more time on, and it was not wet lab work. It was actually about cultural perceptions of death and dying. And this was with a medical anthropologist at Harvard Medical School. And I actually was, you know, going to community centers and talking to older people about their beliefs about death, and how they navigated that for their families, and what they were thinking in terms of what they wanted for themselves as they faced that towards the end of their lives. And that was just really super fascinating to me, that people's beliefs about death are so culturally rooted. Yeah, so that was the other kind of research that I did that was quite different from like the usual like lab research people will do who go into medicine.
Do you have any advice for students interested in the healthcare work?
Sorry, advice for students who are interested in healthcare or in like medicine specifically for being physicians?
Medicine specifically.
Yes, I got it. Okay. Yeah, I think there's this really great book that I have like recommended to a lot of people that I've mentored in the past who have an interest in medicine, and also my kids. I've given them this reference to this book by Bill Burnett and Dave Evans. There are a couple of professors at Stanford University who wrote a book called Designing Your Life. And it was as a function of having spoken to many people in their middle age who decided, or realized rather, that they had not made the right decisions for themselves in terms of professional choices. And a lot of them, like the common theme was that a lot of them pursued careers that they abstractly thought were a good idea because they seemed interesting, because they were well compensated, because they were well regarded, like those professions. So or because their parents told them they should, right? And then they ended up you know, in their middle-aged years, realizing that that's not actually what they wanted to do with their lives, and it wasn't actually what they thought it was, right? So like once they checked off all of the, you know, boxes, and they landed there and they were practicing medicine, for instance. So it wasn't just people who were practicing medicine; it was people of all different professions. They realized it wasn't what they thought it was going to be. And so I really encourage, like the theme of that book is really about not focusing on an outcome, but focusing on process. So thinking for yourself, like, what are my values? Like if one of my values is that in my work, I get to travel, you know, like 25% of the time, or in my work, I want to be most often working in teams and not alone, or in my work, I want it to be very creative, right? Like there are things that you have to realize about yourself that you value, that you want to be a part of your work life, that I think you should, write down on a piece of paper and then try to figure out all of the professions that would allow you to fulfill most of those values. And then like, you might not even know where you end up at this point, but like, as you start to kind of narrow down what meets all of those requirements, then wherever you end up, you're likely to be happy because those are the things that are important to you, right? And some of those things can be like the lifestyle things, right? Like I want to be able to have 6 weeks of vacation a year at least, or I want to be able to make this amount of money, right? Like those can be among your values. But I really encourage things that are not explicitly tied to money, because at the end of the day, that's actually and this is a neuroscience thing, actually, when you meet a very low criterion, I think it's around like $50,000 a year, and all of your basic needs are met, people's happiness beyond that is very, very incremental. It's not very huge in terms of how much happier they are. So I would say like, try to define values for yourself that are not tied to money mostly. And then, yeah, you'll end up somewhere where you'll be happy, even if you don't know where that is right now, as opposed to saying like, I want to go into medicine because whatever reasons you have about abstract notions of why it would be a good thing. And then I think once you've done that and you've come up with like a list of professions, right? So if medicine is among them, and that could be being a doctor, it could be being a physician's assistant, it could be being a nurse. Like there are lots, and a nurse practitioner. There are lots of ways, a public health practitioner, a lot of ways in which you can get involved in medicine, not just as a physician. But once you've like kind of narrowed it down, then I think you need to be intentional about spending some time like basically interviewing people, right? Like taking people out for like a coffee to ask, like just grill them. Like, what are the things that you find most challenging about your profession in a good way and in a bad way, right? Like, do you feel like you made the right decision going into this profession? Why or why not? And spend some time shadowing them also, where you really get to see like the good, the bad, and the ugly, so that you can understand better for yourself, like, would I actually be happy doing this? Because, a lot of people go into medicine and they don't realize that you spend a ton of time documenting in the electronic medical record, not seeing patients necessarily, but like documentation, fighting with insurance companies, feeling very frustrated because most of why your patients come in to see you is not stuff that you can control. It's like, well, they live in a food desert. They don't have access to transportation. They, like so many different things that like, you can't solve that as a doctor other than to like vote, right? Like, just like everybody else can vote for changes in policy, you cannot as one person solve that. And I think many people misunderstand that as a doctor, you're going to be like solving everybody's problems in a big way. And really you realize that you're doing like this much of it. So it's like, you have to be okay with that, understanding the reality of the practice of medicine.
That is amazing advice. And I think like a lot of us have that misconception of like, oh, the doctors are going to solve everything, but you just told us otherwise. So that's nice to know.
How does your work interact with other scientific disciplines such as psychology, computer science, or genetics?
So psychology, I often think of as like, it's like kind of the behavioral correlates of neuroscience. So it's like, we make an observation in terms of people's behavior, right? Like their psychological behaviors or experiences. But then I think it's the responsibility of those in neuroscience to actually turn those into like tractable experimental questions so that we can understand how specifically the activity of brain cells results in those behaviors. So that is how psychology is related. The computer science, I think how it's related to the work that I do, or the work that we do in neuroscience, is that a lot of artificial intelligence is based on, all of it. The entire field is actually based on the organization of visual parts of the brain and how computationally the neurons in those parts of the brain are generating our ability to perceive things, right, visually. And so based on that very basic information that we understood of how visual cortex, which is the visual part of brain, is organized and how it's computing information or data from the world, they started developing the whole field of AI. So that I think is super cool. And I think our understanding of neuroscience continues to inform computer science. And then the flip is also true, like computer science and our ability to process information very quickly has allowed us to do things in neuroscience and further our field within our understanding of the brain. Because, for instance, we can run simulations on computers about neural activity and things like that, that we can then compare to what we experimentally observe. And that really does inform the field further and develop the field further. So that's been really cool too. I don't know, you said psychology, computer science, and what other thing? Or is that enough?
Genetics.
Genetics. Oh, yeah. Genetics and neuroscience, I think, are very much related. I mean, genetics is related to every kind of, I think, biological science. Some of the coolest things in genetics that have happened for the field of neuroscience in the last, I think it's like 15 years at this point, maybe 10 years, 10 to 15 years, is the development of these genetically targeted tools to manipulate the activity of specific neurons in the brain. So you can actually like inject these like genetic constructs into certain parts of the brain, and then you can activate just the part where you injected this thing, where it basically activates the neuron in this very, very specific way, where it's located spatially and then also in a certain cell type. So there are many different cell types in the brain, namely the biggest groups are excitatory cells and inhibitory cells. And then there are also these neuromodulatory cells that actually can be also excitatory or inhibitory. But those different kinds of cell types, we were never able to manipulate them in a super specific way. Like when I was doing my experiments, it was like hitting the brain with like a hammer. It was like very grotesque. I was just like injecting electrical activity everywhere in every kind of cell type in the region. And now you can like super specifically activate only the excitatory cells in that region, or only a subpopulation of inhibitory cells in that region. So you can know like with much more precision what is responsible for this function in the brain or this pathology in the brain.
Cool. And the final question that we have is, what are some of the most important skills that a healthcare professional should have, and how can someone develop these skills?
I think these days, like one of the biggest challenges that we face are like health disparities. And a lot of those are racialized health disparities. So for a lot of different like social, political, historical reasons. And I'll just give you dementia, which is my area of expertise at the moment, epilepsy or dementia, but let's talk about dementia. We have twice the incidence of dementia in people who are African-American, 1.5 times the incidence of dementia in people who are Hispanic or Latino, like 1.1 to 1.2 times the incidence of dementia in people who are Asian American. Indigenous people, who we don't have a huge population of in this country, for historic reasons, obviously, they are around the same as Latino in terms of their increased incidence of this disease relative to those who are white. And it's important to understand those differences as being rooted in structures, right, and systems. And one of those systems is actually medicine, or the medical industrial complex, as we say. So pharma also is implicated, insurance, like all of these different parts of the practice of medicine and making people better in terms of their health are unfortunately impacted or influenced by like structural racism. And so, for instance, in medicine, we have a very disproportionate number of people, disproportionately low number of people who are African-American and who are Latino practicing in this country. And that makes it so that like people who end up in medicine, so it's like a large number of people who are white, a disproportionately high number of people who are Asian American. We don't relate to patients from those communities that have those health disparities in the same way that a practitioner from their communities would relate to them, right? And it's just natural. Like there are just lots of things like culturally in terms of like language you may even use, right? Like the vernacular that you use, that make people a lot more comfortable, and that rapport, that therapeutic relationship can be developed very powerfully in those instances when you relate to them. And when you don't have that, then you have these disparities like we see them. And so that's, I think, one of the greatest challenges right now. The other one that I think like weighs very heavily in my mind is the ways in which AI is trying to insinuate itself in the practice of medicine, specifically like ChatGPT, which I think is super problematic on many levels. And it's still very, very underdeveloped, I think, for being properly deployed in medicine. So that would be the other thing, is that I just have great caution about that. And I think people going into medicine should be very, very aware of what the downsides are to those new technologies.
That was amazing. Very interesting. A lot of stuff I did not know, and very stuff I want to definitely research now that you have talked about it. It sounds very interesting. And I'm assuming you're talking about grandma who has dementia. So that's awesome to hear about that. I'm so glad that you are passionate about that, and that's amazing. And I really appreciate your time. It was amazing. You elaborated so well. So amazing. Thank you so much. I hope we didn't take up too much of your time.
No, guys. Yeah, I appreciate you trying to yourselves about this too.
No, it was really interesting. It was awesome. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Good luck,
All right.
guys.
Thank you.
Bye.